Welcome to the Environment Forum of the Mahindra Humanities Center. My name is Robin Kelsey. I'm Dean of Arts and Humanities and Burden Professor of Photography. And with Ian Miller, Professor of History here in the front row, we convene the Environment Forum at the Mahindra, and we do so under the beneficent graces of Homi Bhabha, the center's director, who could not be here with us today, but we will be thinking of him, and with the extraordinary support of Steve Beal and Sarah Razor, who are unfailingly energetic and dedicated to ensuring that this forum operate at its maximum capacity. When Ian and I first met with Homi to discuss the possibility of launching the Environment Forum, the idea for us was not to bring the environment into the humanities as one more topic or theme, but rather to think about what the humanities would become if we took our relationship to the natural environment seriously. And it has been inspiring to pursue that question from one meeting of the forum to the next. We have a great treat in store for us this evening. Our special guest is Michael Pollan, who last year joined the English department as professor of the practice of creative writing and Louis K. Chan arts lecturer. And we are deeply grateful for that. Michael, as everyone this side of the moon knows, is one of the best writers of nonfiction in English. He is the author of several best-selling and critically acclaimed books, such as Botany of Desire, The Omnivore's Dilemma, and his most recent book, How to Change Your Mind. Michael, through these works, has probed our exchanges with the natural world, particularly the exchanges entailed by our ways of ingesting it. He and his books have been festooned with so many prizes that to list them all would take up much of the evening. So please consult his website if you need any more information along those lines. To converse with Michael, we are very fortunate to have Elaine Scarry, the Walter M. Cabot Professor of Aesthetics and the General Theory of Value, which is my favorite professorial title at Harvard, and Michael's colleague in the English department. Elaine is one of our most accomplished humanists, having written, among many other things, The Body in Pain, Dreaming by the Book, and that compact little volume from her Tanner lecture at Yale on beauty and being just. Our topic this evening is writing the ineffable. Harvard, generally speaking, is deeply effable. And one of the delights about this event is the chance to use the Environment Forum to press against the confident articulations of this institution. And we're going to talk amongst ourselves for a while, and then we're going to open things up for questions. There are going to be 2 microphone stands available in the aisles, but there's also one roving one for people who would find it uncomfortable to get to one of the mics in the aisles. So be thinking about your questions as we proceed. So by agreement, I am going to kick things off. And I'm going to ask Michael about, here's the book, How to Change Your Mind, for those who have not yet gotten it and read it. In addition to giving us a very clear exposition of the new science of psychedelics in this book, you describe your own experience with them. And I wanted to ask you about that decision and what challenges that decision presented to you as a writer.
Good question. Well, thank you all for coming. And Elaine, what an honor to share this table with you, and Robin. Thanks for the invitation. As soon as I decided I was going to be writing a book on psychedelics, obviously the question is then planted right in front of you. Are you going to have these experiences that you're describing? I had written a long piece for the New Yorker before I embarked on this book, in which I didn't do anything. I was very much your omniscient journalist with no skin in the game. But there were a couple reasons that made me decide that I needed to do this. And I have to say it was with some reluctance, because I had had very limited experience of psychedelics as, at the age-appropriate moment in life. I happened to be at a college where there was no psychedelics, and I chose poorly, I guess. But I was also not ready for them. I didn't feel I was terrified of them. And I believed a lot of the scare stories that were around and the real stories that were around. I came of age just a little too late, and the scare stories were dominant in the culture already. People staring at the sun till they go blind, thinking they could fly and falling off of buildings, and people having trips from which they never returned. And so all that weighed on me, and so I kind of avoided them. As a writer, however, I've always tried to find a way to put myself in the story just to offer that unique perspective, writing from inside. And this goes back to, I realized recently, to the time when I was 11 years old, and my parents gave me a copy of a book by a Harvard alum named George Plimpton called Paper Lion. And it was a kind of amazing book. He was also editor of the Paris Review, where he was trying to reinvent sports writing. And he did it by getting onto the field. He persuaded the Detroit Lions to let him play in a scrimmage, go through the summer workout camp, and then play as quarterback in a scrimmage. And he got stuff that not only no sports writer could ever get, because they were on the sidelines, but no player could get, because they'd been playing continually since they were little kids. And so that quality of wonder, of first sight, is available really only to the person doing something for the first time. And I love that book, and I didn't think about it years later, but I started doing that in my work. When I wrote about the cattle industry for Omnivore's Dilemma, I bought a cow. And I became a baby cattle rancher for a couple months, and built a house when I was writing about architecture. And it just gave me a vantage. It gave me humorous possibilities, because you're usually a fish out of water, and that's always valuable in writing. And it gave you narrative. So that was kind of okay to one side. My readers kind of expected something like that. And then the other was, I became intensely curious. For this New Yorker piece I mentioned, I was interviewing cancer patients who had participated in a trial of psilocybin, the chemical in magic mushrooms. And the theory, and they were reprising research that had been done in the 50s and 60s, that having the kind of powerful spiritual experience many people do on psychedelics at a high dose might help them deal with what the doctors called the existential distress of facing your mortality, or the fear of recurrence. And I started interviewing these people, and their stories were so amazing. And I gradually grew envious of them. I had never had a spiritual experience. I've always thought of myself as kind of spiritually retarded. And I was so curious to have what they had and see what that was about. So at a certain point, I realized I have to do this. I don't know how I feel about it. Had many conversations with Judith, my wife, and who had her own trepidations about my doing this. We could invite her up to here, but we won't. But if you're we've been together for a very long time, and if one person in a relationship is going to have a big, supposedly, possibly life-changing experience, that could be very destabilizing to a relationship. And would I change in some ways? And what she didn't think enough about was that I might get better. But we can decide whether I did or not later. So that was kind of the sort of thought process. And then there were all the mechanics of like, how do you do this? How do I find someone? That I couldn't get into the above ground trials at reputable institutions. So I had to find my way into the psychedelic underground to find people who were willing to work with me, knowing that I'd be writing about them, and given that they were doing illegal work. And obviously there were legal considerations too, and we can talk about that later or not. But I definitely had misgivings about that.
Did you anticipate the challenges of writing about it even before you had the experience? I mean, were you thinking about not only what is it going to be like to have the experience, but what is it going to be like to write about the experience?
Without question. I mean, there was the worry about going to jail, and then there was the worry about description. And they don't seem commensurate, but I was actually more worried about the description, because I had read, I'd read Huxley, Doors of Perception, which is the text in a way. I mean, every psychedelic experience since then, or account of it, has been influenced by that, whether you've read it or not. It's one of those powerful accounts. And it was beautiful, and I didn't think I could write any account that good. And then I'd read all these really crappy trip reports that are all over the internet. People, it's like, the quickest way to repel someone is tell them your dreams, right? And psychedelic trips can function in much the same way. So yes, there was a lot of anxiety about it. And the whole time I was working on the book, and there's so many parts of the book that are not my travelogue, as it were, those accounts loomed ahead as these great peaks that I had to get up and across. Definitely.
So one of the reasons that this is particularly germane, I think, to this forum is that a lot of people who get into the environmental humanities get into the environmental humanities because they've had some experiences in the world that more or less feel to them transcendent. And then they go in and they do their studies, and often there's not much of a connection between the experience that got them into the study and how they actually then conduct their research and write about it. And I've been fascinated by that gulf. And it's often only, late in the evening when you say, so why did you, do this?
It's embarrassing.
So, right. So can we talk about that just a little bit about about the what is it that is embarrassing? What is it that is so difficult?
Well, you're talking about academics, and then you're talking about emotion. And no, the experience that gets a lot of people into writing about nature is an experience of awe in nature, and a transcendent feeling. Awe is an overwhelming emotion. We don't understand it very well, and it's interesting that those people don't write about it that much, even though it was the motive force. But I've also met lots of people who got into psychiatry or neuroscience because of a psychedelic experience, and don't necessarily talk about it. So I think sometimes these motivating experiences happen when we're young too, and we construct a more grown-up rationale for what we're doing. But I agree. I think that the experience of awe, anyone who devotes their life to studying nature and the environment, certainly true for me. I see this work as part and parcel of all my writing on nature. I mean, that really has been what's unified all my work. I mean, people think of me as writing about food or psychedelics, but what joins them together, as you pointed out, is these are ways we engage with the natural world. They're not the normal way of admiring it or writing elegies for it or whatever we do, but I've always been attracted to the idea of that we have an active engagement with nature, yet when we mostly write about it, we write about it as spectators. But
Michael, I had a
eating
question.
engages us. Yeah.
Yeah, a moment ago you described yourself as spiritually retarded.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout the book, you say that. You say, I'm not sure I've ever had a spiritual experience. And yet, all your books are about gardens, and you describe even being 4 years old and your first garden being between a lilac bush and a fence and so forth. And are you just saying that in the book as to make everybody feel at ease? And make it more believable when you then start going off into outer space?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I have had experience that from the outside feel like spiritual experience, and I've talked about meals and the communal quality of meals. In some sense, that is spiritual. Many people read Botany of Desire and would tell me that they thought it was spiritual, the fact that I'm imputing agency to the plants, and that I'm trying to see the world from their point of view. But I never saw it. Never felt that way to me. I guess that was that was an idea to me that was very much rooted in what we know about coevolution. So I always felt other people were putting that kind of spiritual gloss on it. But I think though I was having spiritual experiences. I just didn't know it because I was so uncomfortable with that vocabulary, spiritual. I just really had this sense that to be spiritual was to believe in the supernatural. And that's what spirituality is. And that's not a very good definition, but it was the one I had. There was I saw myself as a materialist in terms of my philosophical attitude. And people who were spiritual had left the realm of explaining things according to the laws of nature. And one of the big things to come out of the kinds of spiritual experiences I had in writing this book was not a belief in the supernatural, which some people do come out of psychedelic experience absolutely convinced of, and who knows, they may be right. I mean, this idea of that there's some universal consciousness, Huxley talked about the mind at large, the idea that consciousness is not necessarily the product of brains, that it might exist in the world. And there are physicists who believe this, but I tended to think that consciousness was a product of the brain. But I totally reset my understanding of what spirituality was in the course of writing the book. And that happened, let me see, how can I guess, maybe we should hold that till I've talked about some of the experiences.
So,
because it doesn't make sense
without
a long...
Can we talk about the experiences, but I especially want to talk about them as a writer, right? When you'd had the experiences, what were the challenges and the risks that you experienced as you tried to write about what you?
Well, the first challenge, and always the challenge when you're writing, is boredom, right? I mean, that you're going to bore your readers. And you're going to describe something that's so idiosyncratic to you, like your dreams, that who else would care about it? And as as a writer of nonfiction, you always have one eye on. I mean, you have this internal boredom meter, of impatience, and this comes out of writing for newspapers and magazines, and where I just know how long I can venture down a digression before I'm going to lose people. I can just feel them like closing the book, and that's my anxiety as a writer. And so there was that I would bore people. Then there was the fact that would anyone understand it? Because what happens is so strange and hard to explain. William James, who wrote about mystical experience, which is the best analog we have, I think, for the psychedelic experience, his whole analysis. And one of the qualities of the mystical experience is ineffability, that it transcends the categories we have, the words we have. It's not like anything else that's ever happened to us. And so there was that. How do you F the ineffable? And so that was a concern. And I just didn't, and I had one experience in particular, the most kind of upsetting and violent one, that not only did I have an experience of ego dissolution, which had happened on an earlier experience, and is also, by the way, a hallmark of mystical experience. The fact that your sense of self melts away, and when that happens, if you're not panicking, if you're surrendering to it, there's this sense, since there are no boundaries anymore between you and the world, you have no ego defenses, you're merging with something larger. And that, I think, is the heart of the mystical experience, which is a wonderful sense of being one with nature, being one with other people, feeling, powerful currents of love. All these things that happen when we're undefended. That was going to be hard to describe. But anyway, that was the template, William James, and it holds up really well. But so how was I going to put words to this? I'd never tried to write about something like this, and there was definitely some worry about that. And I wrote after each of my experiences. So just so you know, I had like 5 or 6 different, 7 psychedelic experiences on a range of different substances, and one of them, so LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, and a very weird one that called 5-MeO-DMT, which is this is going to sound odd, but it's the smoked venom of the Sonoran desert toad. The ingenuity of humans to figure this out. We got this toad here, and you know what we're going to do with it? We're going to milk it of its venom and smoke it, and something will happen.
Night, wearing a headlight.
Yes, wearing a headlight to capture them. Yeah. Now, when we're writing, we need certain things. We need the element of time. We need the element of space, and we need a being, a character of some kind. Those are kind of, essential ingredients. I mean, you can write without them, but it's difficult. I'd never done it. And on this particular psychedelic, where you take a single puff, and before you have exhaled, you have left the earth, and you're in a completely different dimension. And it's just terrifying, because not only do you experience a loss of self, but you experience a loss of any reference of there is no time, there is no space, there is no matter, there's just pure energy. You're just in this storm of mental, you don't even know if it's mental, but just this energy. It's kind of like pre-Big Bang, as we all remember that. But that's what I mean, of the difficulty of describing it. So I had none of the elements from which we traditionally construct a narrative. So I didn't know how I was going to deal with that. But the bigger worry was just surviving that one, let alone writing about it, because it was really terrifying. It was not. The best thing about that experience was it only lasted 20 minutes. But I didn't know it was 20 minutes.
So, Elaine, as a reader, what did you take away from Michael's passages about his experience?
Well, I
about how
thought,
he
good,
approached
I don't have to do this, because I've experienced it through him.
That's
and
a public service.
Yeah. No, and it's so graphically described. And, I thought that in a number of cases, there's a strong element of synesthesia. In your first event that you described with LSD, the musical notes are turning into building blocks, and then members of your family are inhabiting them. And then in the one with psilocybin, again, there's the music is, whether it's a kind of music you didn't like, or whether it's Yo-Yo Ma playing a cello suite. The very direct transformation, synesthetic experiences into color and visual events or tactile events. Like at one moment you feel that you've become the cello and Yo-Yo Ma's horsehair.
I can feel it.
You're
over
the
my
strings,
skin,
yeah. And I think that in studies that I've read of synesthesia, and you talk later in the book about synesthesia, one theory is that all the kind of pruning that we learn to do to separate sections of our brain when we're infants and toddlers and so forth is incomplete in people who have synesthesia. And there's crosstalk between the areas of the brain. And one thing that's very interesting is that some neuroscientists, like this person Ramachandran, who's got a very prominent place in this world, believe that that is the heart of how metaphor works. That when you use a metaphor, you are actually experiencing a moment of crosstalk in the brain, and you're actually eliciting it from your readers, because they may have not themselves had the ability or the tendency to have this kind of breakdown in the areas of the brain, but you can prompt it by this unexpected leap. And so I thought that, and of course the things that are happening to you during the event are themselves, I mean, they're literally happening, but they're not quite literal events. Like you gave birth to your son in one of them. It's not a literal event, but it's as though it's metaphor that then requires other metaphors to communicate it. And yet, that's not getting away from the heart of the experience. That is the very experience that's going on cognitively, is that there's all this kind of crosstalk.
And that's what we are coming to understand neuroscientifically.
Yeah.
I mean, there's one illustration in the book that shows how the brain is wired when you're straight, and how it gets rewired on psilocybin. It's really interesting because you have this situation where all these different brain networks that are ordinarily, since that pruning period that you're describing, are kind of segregated.
Yeah.
And they only communicate with one another through this, master control of the default mode network, which is where the ego appears to reside. And that suddenly, when that network goes quiet, which happens on psychedelics, at least according to fMRI imaging of the brain, this particular kind of orchestra conductor of the brain network goes quiet, suddenly you get these new connections springing up. And so your sense of smell might talk to your sense of sight, might talk to your sense of music. And you're right, and I think that is why it's such a metaphoric process. And that and that is, to me, the most salient part of it, is the fact that music in particular, it becomes so concrete, so, the most powerful experiences of music, both good and bad, that I'd ever had. Yeah. So I think that is what it is. It's a temporary rewiring the brain, and in a way it is going back to child consciousness, before all that pruning and division of labor has happened in the brain. And one of the people I talk to in the book, I interview, is Alison Gopnik, the child psychologist. And she's convinced that psychedelic experience is the closest we can come to the mind of the child. It's kind of the Wordsworthian drug.
My kids definitely seem that way at
well,
certain
most
points.
kids, 4-year-olds and under 5 and younger, I mean, many aspects of their consciousness is pretty psychedelic. It's, they have trouble focusing on a task. They're taking in information from all sides at once instead of, she describes it as there's spotlight consciousness, which is what we have as adults, and we can attend to a particular task or focus. And then there's a lantern consciousness, which is taking in information from all over. And in some ways, their consciousness is actually more accurate than ours, because when you focus, you edit out too much. And
Wordsworth says, of the child, O best philosopher, a line that Coleridge thought was preposterous. But it's consistent with what you're saying.
And she's done these really interesting experiments where she'll give a task, she'll design a game, a task, and for many kinds of thinking, kids will outperform adults. Little kids will outperform adults if the task requires throwing out the rules of the game and trying something completely different. So for example, she created this Blicket detector, and if you put a block of the right shape on in the right position, the whole thing goes off, and there's lights and music, and it's very exciting. And if she changes the rule, and adults can do it pretty well, kids can do it pretty well, if she changes the rules so that it's not the shape of the block, it's 2 blocks, this radical change in the rules, kids will get it before adults do. because we are in these narrow channels of behavior and pattern. We're very good at recognizing pattern, but then we get stuck in pattern. And kids don't get stuck in pattern. So she sees that as a good analog of psychedelic consciousness.
That's fascinating. I want to ask you another question about the challenge of writing about the ineffable. So there's a wonderful quotation in your book that is, "The mystical journey seems to offer a graduate education in the obvious." Which could you say a little more about what you mean?
I mean, in some ways, that's the toughest part, is that you have profound epiphanies that are completely banal and that they belong on a Hallmark card. And the number of people who have had psychedelic experiences where they discover that love is the most important thing in the universe.
Which is what you discovered.
Which I did discover. And by the way, it's true. Can we just stipulate that? But how do you write about it in a way that isn't like ridiculous? And so I struggle with that. I mean, there's no irony in the psychedelic experience that I detected. I'm sure some people have had ironic experiences. But yeah, that was a struggle. And so the way I dealt with it finally, it took me a long time to figure out how to do this. And I wrote these accounts right after, and when I read them over, I was like, ugh, this is not going to work. But one of the things I've learned from reading a lot of memoir, and this is something I've talked to my students about, is that they really get interesting when there's kind of a double consciousness. When you're writing, you're not just immersed back in the 4-year-old self or the 8-year-old self, telling the whole narrative that way, but you're kind of jumping back and forth between the adult perspective and the kid's perspective. Mm-hmm. And that really gives, James Baldwin does this beautifully in Notes of a Native Son, and Orwell does it too in his memoirs. And it gives a kind of tautness or friction to the narrative. So I decided that when I got to something that was kind of ridiculously banal, or that I knew my reader was going to struggle with, I just acknowledged it, and I talked about it, and I said, I kind of broke the fourth wall and said, I know how dumb this sounds, or I know how implausible this sounds, and so that the reader, I was giving her something to hold on to, that I could see it from their point of view, even as I was seeing it from my point of view. And so a lot of it is going back and forth, and in some ways you could say I didn't have the courage of my convictions, which is probably true. But I found that I could talk about something like the graduate education, the obvious, in the midst of this, and say at the same time, I know how it sounds, but isn't it also true? And so there's a kind of a doubling of the perspective, and I found when I did that, it just freed me. And after I had kind of come up with that approach, and I don't do it that many times, but like for example, in describing the toad trip, I'm very aware, and I say, look, I'm going to give you a couple metaphors, because metaphors can help us with ineffability, as you were suggesting. They're not quite right, and I proceed to give them. One is I had the sensation that I was strapped to the outside of a rocket that was taking off, and this thing was shuddering horribly, and the G-forces were like pulling my face down, and we were rising through the sky and through clouds, and then I said, it was a little like that. That's all I could promise. And then I offered another metaphor, and so I found metaphors saved me in many ways, even when they weren't perfect. And I was very frank about the fact this isn't exactly what I felt, but this is what I can give you. This is an analog. So in a way, yeah, being straight with the reader was helpful. And then after that, I have to say, I had a really good time writing these scenes. I probably had more pleasure in the writing than I've had in anything I've ever written. And that was a surprise. I really didn't expect that. Part of it was the freedom as I'm a journalist. I'm a nonfiction writer. I write in this tight box of fact-checkable facts. And here I was describing the contents of my imagination, and nobody could fact check this stuff. I felt more like I imagine, I've never written fiction, but as I imagine the novelist feels, who is, describing a narrative unfolding in his or her head. And
Well,
that's
also,
very freeing.
all your descriptions of your ego or your will, like when you say, my ego was back in uniform and on patrol, it so prepares the reader for not kind of pulling back from you when you suddenly do surrender anything that has to do with will or ego.
Well, ego is a really important term in this whole thing, and to me, that was the big takeaway of the experience: is that you could lose your ego and not die. You could lose your ego and still have a vantage, a presence, which is anyway. That was my biggest experience. Was on this one psilocybin trip. I had an experience of looking out at some point and seeing me, and I know this isn't going to make a lot of sense, but kind of burst into a little puff of Post-it notes. But I was fine with it. And who was this I that was fine with it, if that's me? Well, I discussed actually trying to explain, well, there's another first person pronoun that we need to understand this experience. But it turns out I'm not identical to my ego, and that I can acquire this distance on it, and what that perspective was, I don't know, because it was very different than me. It was very objective. It had complete equanimity about what was happening. I think this is the perspective Aldous Huxley would have called the mind at large. He would believe that at that moment he was acquiring a kind of more transcendental perspective that maybe belongs to the universe, not to individuals. I don't know.
I think that the double voice you have in writing about it is very important for a number of reasons. One is I actually think it stages or performs this disidentification with the ego, or at least this kind of toggling. I also think it's a very generous way to write, because you didn't lose the readers who had not had this experience, because you always gave them back their voice, which is this well, that sounds like a Hallmark card or whatever.
Well, I was honoring their skepticism, and we didn't talk about it at the beginning, but that is one of the challenges. I mean, unlike pain, Elaine's written brilliantly about the ineffability of pain, and I was comparing that to psychedelic experience. We can all imagine pain. We've all been in pain, but I knew that there would be a substantial portion, or I hope there'd be a substantial portion of my readers who had not had a psychedelic experience, and I didn't want them to feel left out, or that I wasn't writing to them. And that had been something I'd noticed in most of the literature around psychedelics. It kind of assumed you were in on the game, you were in the tent, and I didn't want to do that, definitely.
I thought that one of the things that I noticed once when I was trying to deal with this problem as it happens with certain kinds of labor, like coal mining, is that if a feature of something is that it's inexpressible, then if you're able to express it, there's a certain way in which you're in danger of falsifying it. So let's say that, I was looking at the example of coal mining. It happens that one of my grandfathers was a coal miner. But I was looking at coal mining in Zola's Germinal and in Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier. And if you say, well, this phenomenon of labor has these features, A, B, C, D, and then it has this other feature, which is ineffability. And if you can get to the A, B, C, D, that's great, except that now you've falsified this one, because a key feature of it is that it's inexpressible. And the way that Zola and Orwell solve that is by very carefully describing the path towards which the thing gets made, comes into being, and the path away by which it gets unmade. Literally, I mean, incredible descriptions in Germinal of the long drop down to the ground and long passage through tunnels, and same with Orwell. And then much of the book is structured on the getting out. But that's true of your book, that you give us the kind of passage to approach it, and then the kind of coming away from it again, so that we're not only getting the features of it in very graphically rendered images that you haven't even begun to describe here tonight, but all of you should read these. These are amazing accounts. But you're also given this very careful preparation, not only in the whole kind of scientific neuroscience and the work that's been done with cancer patients and people who are addicted and so forth, not only in your claims that this is the start of neuroscience and the start of, I think you actually even start the Silicon Valley is coming out of this. I can't remember how you pulled that one off, but
think I oversold that?
yeah, I thought that was a little bit. But then, you know, then the actual experiences are like the jewel in the center, and there, you know, he if you haven't read this, he interviews 15 spiritual guides before he actually arrives at the ones who are going to be there to assist him, and those descriptions of the rejected guides are often, you know, quite hilarious. But well,
they're people you just don't want to have a psychedelic experience with. There's a lot of them.
And the other thing is that you realize that he's really afraid he's going to die. You're really afraid you're going to die, you know, because it can have an effect on your heart, and so it is this very dramatic thing. But this set of attributes that are gradually coming into being are preceded by this very carefully wrought account of the progress of approaching the thing, and then the retreat from it. So.
Well, I mean, in my writing, I really like to approach whatever is the center of it, you know, whether it's our relationship to plants or psychedelic experience, in a circular way. And like, let's look at it scientifically, let's look at it historically, let's look at it, I don't know, anthropologically, let's look at it therapeutically. And then there's the personal too, and no one perspective is adequate. It's been a conviction of my work for a very long time. You know, the scientists don't always have the last word. Sometimes the poets get there first. But it's by multiplying perspectives that you really begin to get a richer portrait of it.
And speaking of multiplying perspectives, why don't we take this occasion to open it up for questions? And we do want questions. I've talked with Michael about his experience in talking about his book, and there's many people in the world who have had experience with psychedelics, and many of them like to talk about those experiences. And I'm sure they're very, very interesting, but it would be great if we could get questions. Be fantastic. Yes, please. And the mics are coming down the aisles. And for anyone who has difficulty coming to a mic in an aisle, there is also, I believe, a roving mic.
It's not on.
I think he's gone.
Turning it on.
All right. Okay. So are you still a materialist in terms of consciousness, and what actually shook your faith maybe in materialism, and how did you approach it before you got into this experience?
So I'm glad you brought this up, because I left something hanging earlier. So this experience of ego dissolution, which I really think is central to the psychedelic experience when it works, and it doesn't always happen. For people to be willing to let their ego completely dissolve, they have to feel very safe. And that's why the choice of guide is so important. But the change that I underwent was I went from thinking that the opposite term for spiritual was, or for material, or opposite term for spiritual was material. And I came to understand, after having this period of time where my ego was gone, I felt like when your ego is gone, your defenses are down, you feel emotion in this powerful way, and particularly the emotion of love. You feel your place in nature has completely changed. You no longer feel you're an object, you're a subject, and everything else is an object. You lose actually the subject-object duality falls apart when the ego falls apart. It's all objective or all subjective, whatever. And that, so this powerful connection, I had this sense of, being in my garden, and this sense that consciousness was spread very evenly over all the species in the garden. I didn't have a monopoly on consciousness. The plants had it too. So it made me realize that it's the ego that stands in the way of spiritual experience. And that for me, and this is a very non-supernatural definition of it, the opposite of spiritual is egotistical. And it is the walls that our egos build that keeps us from feeling our connection to nature, that keeps us from feeling love in its most profound manifestation. So for me, that was a big change. I kind of redefined spirituality for myself, and that was that was the news. That was the news for me. I mean, I know other people come out of it with an idea of universal consciousness, and I've heard from a lot of people since the book came out that I didn't take that idea seriously enough, and that maybe I should, and maybe I should look into it. I still feel like I am a materialist about consciousness. But I also know enough about this area that we actually don't know that brains produce consciousness. There's remarkably little evidence of that. It seems to me the more parsimonious theory, but there are people who make good arguments it's not. As the Dalai Lama said, the idea that brains produce consciousness is an interesting hypothesis, but that's all it is so far.
Well, at one point, you report someone is asking you how confident you are that God does or doesn't exist, and you say, well, 2 to 3% chance.
Oh yeah,
and he
no,
says,
that was about immortality.
That's
that was
about immortality.
Yeah.
And the person says to you, but that's a lot. That's a high percentage.
I was interviewing a Roland Griffith, who is really the scientist at Hopkins who's done the most to get this started, the research started. And he's a very prominent drug abuse researcher, actually. And he had a mystical experience in his meditation practice. And that got him very interested in altered states of consciousness and got him raising questions about the nature of consciousness. And when I was interviewing him the first time, it was the weirdest question to hear from a scientist. I've interviewed lots of scientists. And he'd said, so, what do you think the chances are that anything happens after you die? And I'm like, I don't know, 2 or 3%? He says, that's a lot. I guess it is a lot. I don't know where I came up with that number, though. It may have been journalistic tactic, because if I'd said 0, given I knew he was a spiritual person, I would have less connection with him, right? So I don't know if I really believed it. Maybe I'm being defensive now. Thanks.
Hi. So I understand and appreciate that when you were describing describable experiences, it was important to you to have disclaimers to the audience that this might not make sense. You might not understand this. Was there any part of doing that was anxiety that you would lose the readers whose trust you had built, maybe in other writing or with the works that you had leading up to this? Were you afraid of losing that trust? Did you think about what would happen if you didn't make those disclaimers?
Yeah, I didn't think of them in that context. I mean, I did have a general awareness that I'd written 7 books before this, and they were on very different topics, and that people who'd read me on food and nature and agriculture read me on this. But I think you make that leap of faith. You don't do things currying favors with your readers is a sure path to bad writing. So. No, it was more just any reader who hadn't had psychedelic experience. I wanted to honor their skepticism and honor because I shared it. You know, I didn't know how much weight to put on this experience. I didn't know how true it was. I still don't. There's so much about the experiences I have I'm still processing. I mean, it's kind of one of the interesting things about it is that you have powerful visual images that become almost these visual koans that you just kind of turn over in your head, and I still do. And I don't know what they mean. I don't know where they came from. And so it really is just the bringing of my normal journalistic skepticism into this psychic space. So it wasn't just for keeping the reader on board. I mean, yes, I'm always thinking about that to some extent, but it really was because I didn't emerge from the process a convert in the way that Huxley does. You know, Huxley I've said really nice things about, and he's a wonderful writer, but I find his account a little credulous, or not credulous. I think he had the experience his philosophy prepared him to have, and that he wanted to have, and that he was illustrating a kind of metaphysics that he already had with the mind at large and the idea that there was a common core of mysticism to all religions. There's a footnote in the book where I compare him to another account of a mescaline experience the same year, 1954, by a much less well-known writer named Henri Michaud, who wrote a book about his mescaline experience called Miserable Miracle. And Michaud, who's a poet and an artist, yeah, it's not, you know, you can guess what he thought about it. But his challenge as a writer was, I am not going to distort this experience with metaphor. I am not going to distort it with even complete sentences. It was like my Toad experience. This was such a chaotic, inchoate experience that I would be doing violence to it, to render it in narrative, to render it with metaphor. And so you have the neat, elegant account of Huxley on this side, and you have the absolutely unreadable, crazy account of Michaud, whose writing descends into drawings at various points because he just can't figure out what to say. I definitely didn't want to go down that path, but I respected it. And whereas I thought that Huxley was being a little bit glib, and that his whole thing just felt neat to me. So in a way, those were my Scylla and Charybdis. I was like trying to find a path between those two models, both of which I had trouble with.
Great. Yeah.
I'm curious if you've had any psychedelic experiences since writing the book, or if you feel like you've gotten kind of all or most of what you can get from these experiences.
Yeah, I have not had any experiences since I did the research for the book. A couple reasons for that. Now I'm, out publicly talking about having broken the law and don't want to be, don't want to put myself at risk, but more importantly, don't want to put my guides at risk. We didn't talk about the way I did this, but I was never alone. I was with people who are very professional, but taking these chances with their freedom. And so if I were to work with one of them again, and I really believe, by the way, in having a guide when you're doing a psychedelic experience, if you want to have a profound experience, you don't want to just be walking around, the street or even in the woods on your own. You have to have an experience of ego dissolution. You have to feel so safe and in such reliable company. So anyway, no, the answer isn't. If it were legal, I would definitely do it again. I can totally imagine a scenario where I would do this every year on my birthday. That would be kind of a good way to use these tools. And a stock taking, addressing kind of problems, connecting with loved ones who have died. I mean, all these kind of things that happen. If we lived in a different world, and we may get there, by the way. I mean, we're closer to some form of FDA approval of psilocybin than you would guess. It could be 2021, pretty soon. So anyway, but thanks for your question. No.
Yeah.
Now, you were introduced tonight as a person who writes about nature. and we just sort of, the word was just uttered without really defining it, which is fine. But it's a lot of writers and philosophers have pointed out that the concept of nature is pretty problematic, because on the one hand, any experience that a person in human society has of nature is unavoidably mediated by society. But on the other hand, human society is itself just kind of a natural phenomenon. So it's very difficult to know where to draw the line between what's nature and what's not nature. And of course, you've written a lot about how the relationship between even humans and plants, the plants that we cultivate, is very, I guess you would say, dialectical. So I would love to hear you talk about how you define that concept, how you draw that line, and also maybe even how your both how your experiences as a writer and your experiences with psychedelics has helped to inform your understanding of that concept and that distinction.
I'm going to dwell on the second half of that, because the first half we don't have the time for. Sure. And I totally agree with you that it's a problematic conception and that we define it in many different ways. The fact that we, define ourselves out of nature so often, routinely, people who write about nature often think of humans as standing apart from that. And that's, I think, a very curious thing about us. I mean, we feel like we're in nature, but we're not in nature. So this is something I've written about a lot. But in this sense, I'm using it in terms of the other species we share the world with and our engagement with them, and the fact that we co-evolve with other species, and they, as I wrote about in Botany of Desire, their evolutionary strategy, understanding that there's no intention involved, is often to gratify our desires. And our desires include changing consciousness. And there are certain species who have engaged with us on that level, and the psilocybin mushroom is definitely one of them. In terms of my own attitudes toward nature, they were affected profoundly by the experience. And specifically, the kinds of ideas that in Botany of Desire were an intellectual conceit, this idea that plants manipulate us, even as we manipulate them, that the corn, the corn plant or the apple tree is using us for its own purposes, or that the grasses have evolved to get us to mow them, which would seem to be anti the grass's interest. But in fact, the main grass interest is keeping the trees from coming back. So we're actually doing their bidding when we cut them down to this size. And so those kind of like thinking our way through the natural world and who's in charge and all that kind of stuff has been something I enjoy thinking about and I've thought about a lot. But in the midst of the first psychedelic experience that I describe in the book, which was the psilocybin experience, unguided, that took place in my garden, I had all these intellectual conceits became flesh. They became real. I mean, the plants really were looking at me. They were returning my gaze, and as I said, I had the sense that consciousness was spread very evenly over the natural world. They were totally benign, and wished me well, I felt, and I don't have to say I know how crazy this sounds, but what had been an intellectual conceit became a conviction, at least during the time of the experience. And that goes to another quality of mystical experience that James talked about, the noetic quality, that there is this weird authority that whatever epiphany you have, whatever insight or even opinion you have is not a mere opinion. It's a revealed truth. And that's an amazing quality, I think, of psychedelics. I don't understand it. It may flow from the idea that you've destroyed the usual subject-object division so that everything seems objective. you know, it's not just, if there's no thinking subject, there can't just be opinions, you know, or points of view. It's just all is. But I don't really understand how it happens. It's very valuable in a therapeutic context because you have addicts, for example, who have an insight. There was a smoking study done that I described where they realize, gee, there's so many amazing things to do and see in this world. I've just had this experience of flying through Western history. I sprouted wings and I saw my body rise from the Ganges, and what a stupid thing to smoke and shorten your life. And that banal insight, there's another banal insight, has the force of revealed truth and allows that person to never have another cigarette. That's so curious. So anyway, I had that noetic quality about these ideas of my relationship to other species, and that was powerful. Do I now think the plants are gazing at me when I walk through the garden? No. But I also now question my normal straight perception, and that you know, things are hidden from us in our, you know as Huxley said, where consciousness is filtering out more than it's letting in, and that it just allows us access to what he called the measly trickle of information we need to survive, and that there's a whole lot of other things going on that we don't see day to day.
Yeah.
This is tall, sorry. Hi, so we talked a little bit about you talked about your process in the book a little bit about how you were writing, and it's clear from your other books too that you write from a place of vulnerability to kind of like invite your readers to join you. And I was wondering, because psychedelics are such a vulnerable experience, if like your actual, like we're talking about, you know, the theme of this is writing the ineffable, and I'm wondering, for like bare bones process-wise, how did this differ for you? What was your process like for writing this book compared to Botany of Desire or Omnivore's Dilemma, or even your books on architecture?
Yeah, I don't know that the process was fundamentally different. I think what you're saying about vulnerability is interesting. I like to write from a position of naivete or ignorance, and almost everything I've written, if you read the first paragraph or two, I'm kind of an idiot, and you know, I don't know things, and I realized I really like writing at the beginning of the learning curve rather than at the end as an expert. And most of us, especially most of us in academia, we don't start writing until we've got it all figured out, and we impersonate the person who has it all figured out on page 1, and I've always found that a bit of a turnoff. And that I think the reader likes to go on a journey with you of learning. So this book, like all my books, begins in a state of ignorance, relatively, and curiosity, and that we're going to learn all this together. And I think that's generally a good writing strategy. I think it's awkward for the academic for various reasons having to do with conventions, and you know, that vulnerability is not welcome in academia. But in general, it was similar. It was that kind of like, I'm going to learn everything I can. I've got a file called science. I've got a file called history. I've got a file called memoir, you know, and I'm going to fill those up and then figure out how to layer them. The big difference is, and this is maybe getting a little too granular, is that most of my books, each chapter has had the multiplication of perspectives in it. So in Botany of Desire, there's a chapter on the apple, and you learn about Johnny Appleseed, and you learn about the biology of the apple tree and my own experiences, and da-da-da-da-da. Here, I couldn't do that for some reason. There was the psychedelics, the experience and the science of it, and each chapter had to be a different lens. And I'm not sure exactly why that was, something about the nature of the subject. So, but it wasn't fundamentally different.
Thanks. Yeah.
I really didn't want to be the last person to ask a question because mine is quite
Because it's got to be
small.
really good, right?
Yeah. Oh, great. I'm so glad. So, yeah, I kind of have a technical question. I'm quite curious about your, it's also about process. I'm curious about your note-taking, the note-taking process. How it's different when you're trying to write about being on a psychedelic drug
Yeah.
versus when you're writing about things that are effable. Are you taking notes while you're on the drug? What does your notebook look like at the end if you are? If you're not, when do you start
Yeah.
taking notes? And I guess related to that too, no, I'll just leave it there.
So
Well-
we want granular.
Yes, I
Yeah,
know.
we're
We
serious.
want granular.
I guess I'm also
Okay,
curious about-
here's some grains for you.
I guess just to add on one more thing, I'm curious about how many, if there's a difference, if you felt like you had a lot more or less drafts that you had to write in order to get to the final version compared
Of
to
this
when you're
of the trips.
compared to when you're writing about things that are effable.
Yeah. So I couldn't take notes during the experience. It was just too, I did bring my computer into one session, and that was a huge mistake. I had wanted to perform an experiment that I'd heard about, which was the rotating mask experiment. There's this famous experiment in psychology of a mask that's convex on one side and concave on the other, and it rotates. And something really interesting happens as you begin to perceive the back of it, it pops out, because the brain will not allow you to see a concave face. Faces are convex. And it's an example of what's called predictive coding, the fact that most of what we see is a prediction rather than a literal sensory data. And I'd heard that people on psychedelics, it didn't happen. They could see the back of the mask. And it's true of schizophrenics, apparently. They can see the back of the mask. So this very important brain function is, I wanted to test it. The mere, and I thought I would take some notes too, the mere act of having the computer in the room, Leary famously talked about set and setting, that the experience is highly vulnerable to your expectations and the environment you're in. I had, half of this experience was this horrible computer world where the graphics of that mask became the graphics I experienced, and the music summoned this video game world that I hated and I felt trapped in for like hours. So I never brought my computer into the room again. And I felt like to write notes during the experience would represent not completely surrendering to it, which all my guides had said was really the key to a successful experience, is not to fight anything about it. If you see a monster, you're supposed to step right up to it and ask what it's doing in your brain. If you see a staircase, you're supposed to climb it. You're just supposed to, John Lennon said it, relax your mind and float downstream. And taking notes didn't go with that. So what I did instead was I asked my guides to record anything I said, and I would try to say a few things to them, which never was better than like spectacular, or gnomic utterances like, I don't want to be so stingy with my feelings. That was a note. And so that wasn't that helpful. But what I did do, and actually what the guides, both in the university trials and the underground experiences tell you, is write a journal right after. So that night, I did two things. One was Judith debriefed me over dinner, and I said as much as I could about the experience, and that was actually really helpful because she could connect it to other things that, and had various insights. Because what you're doing is you're taking something that's non-linear, non-narrative, and you're trying to turn it into a narrative. And you are doing violence to it in a way, because there's tons of it that makes no sense, and you're kind of editing that out. And so then I would write this long, loose journal that would be like 15 single-space pages of everything I could remember about the experience. And that became the raw material later. But one of the things that's striking about the experience is you don't have trouble remembering it. It's not like dreams, where you feel that undertow pulling it out of your conscious awareness, and you have to fight it to preserve it. I've talked to people who can vividly recall trips they had 30 years ago. It's just stored in the memory in a very different way. But anyway, I use these journals, and that was the key.
So we'll take a couple more questions. Yeah.
Thank you for being here. I'm a Div School alum, and so when you talk about things like the plants all having consciousness. That doesn't sound crazy at all to us, and
I'm
please
so
come
glad.
over to our corner of the world. I see a few other Div School folks. My question was how this has influenced your thoughts about what you'll write next.
Frankly, it's made what I'm going to do next harder to think about. I've never had an experience that affected me in so many ways that was so as consuming as this one, you know, in terms of occupying all my imagination and whatever skills I have, that when I think of other topics, they seem kind of small right now. I'm sure that'll change. It takes me a while. You know, my agent had some idea for a, you know, I had lunch with her the other day. She said, "You need to write a short, scary book about food and climate change." And someone needs to write that book, but it had no appeal to me. I'm much more interested in continuing this exploration of self and consciousness. I don't know where it goes, but one of the things I learned is that there are many other ways to explore this besides psychedelics, meditation being a very important one, and meditation being the way many people keep their psychedelic experiences alive for themselves. There's a very interesting progression from psychedelics to Buddhism that many Americans have followed, and there's a logic to that, and the brain network are affected in similar ways. So I'm kind of more interested in that general area, but I have no idea. I have no idea. What I normally do between books is write a couple articles, and then, you know, one of them turns out to be a bottomless well of stuff I have to learn, and I realize that's the next book. But I don't know what it is yet.
I will keep my eye on the New Yorker and the New York Times Magazine and look
Thank
forward
you.
to it.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, thanks very much for the book. I enjoyed it. We're at Harvard, and you just mentioned Timothy Leary, and so I'd like to pursue that a little bit more. Those of us who were involved in psychedelics way back then in the 60s when Timothy Leary was walking among us believed that you give everybody acid and we'll have universal peace. And what you've described and what we're talking about here is a very individual, very personal experience. And I'm a little bit, but we're doing it in a context of a center which I imagine is concerned about the planet, concerned about the environment. Is there potential in psychedelics for redressing, repairing our relationship with the environment as a society beyond the individual?
I think it's a great question and a great question to end on. You know, a lot of people who do this research, even university researchers, you know, psychopharmacologists and pharmacologists, come out of this work thinking this really does have relevance for our predicament. And they're a little nervous about talking that way because of Timothy Leary. But many people emerge from the experience with that conviction that it has something to offer us now. And I don't think it's an accident that this revival of research is happening right now. There's two ways to look at this. I do believe that from my own experience and also from the research, that the nature of the psychedelic experience has a very specific relevance for what I see as the two biggest problems that face us as a civilization. One is tribalism, and the other is the environmental crisis. And in this sense, both are based on the objectifying of the other and of building walls rather than bridges. And that the psychedelic experience, because of the fact that it can lead to this ego dissolution and the opening of these channels of connection, this sense of connection is the most powerful thing that comes out of it. Some of the researchers have even sought to measure this, and there's a scale psychologists have called nature connectedness, where they actually, I mean, going back to your question, they assess through a questionnaire how much do you feel you're in nature or outside of nature. And people's scales change dramatically after a psychedelic experience. And that doesn't surprise me at all that would happen. My guess is if you did a similar scale for how tribal you feel, how much you feel that your group is, you know, different than the other, because those two things are growing from the same place of objectification, right? So if these drugs have the power to address those two problems, then you get to another huge challenge, which is how do you prescribe a drug for a culture? You can't. I mean, Timothy Leary tried to do it. He would make calculations on napkins about how many Americans he'd have to turn on to change America, and it was like 2.9 million. He had or 1.9 million. Well, that many people were turned on, and everything didn't change. You're not going to put it in the water. It's not like fluoride. So that's where you run into trouble. And that was a debate in the 50s, whether the goal was, if these drugs did have a positive social effect, and Huxley believed this too, many people believed this during the 50s and 60s, how do you spread those ideas? Leary's theory was turn on everybody. He was a Democrat. He was a populist of psychedelics. Huxley and several other people that he was affiliated with, researchers, were like terrified by this idea. And they had a much more Mandarin approach. You turn on the elite. And there were efforts to turn on the elite. That's how it got into Silicon Valley. Artists, writers, politicians, people in the church. And there was a deliberate effort, I talk about it in the book, to turn on these people with the thought that this new kind of consciousness would filter down. That didn't really work either. But the possibility is there. And we can all think of, an individual who might really would benefit from a psychedelic trip, but it actually wouldn't work because you really have to want to have your ego dissolved. And, that's his superpower, right? Objectification of the other. So maybe you slip it into his tea. But I don't think that's going to work either, because you really have to, you really do have to want what the experience is. So that's the dilemma. That's the dilemma where we are. I think it's highly relevant to the kinds of questions we're facing. But exactly how you get from here to there, that's a tough one. My next book, RX for America.
I want to thank all of you for coming. I know there were a lot of things going on this evening, and it's a very busy time of the semester. I want to thank Elaine for coming as a conversant.
I want to thank you too.
And I want to thank Michael as well for his fantastic contribution.
Thank you, Robin.